you something. When was the last time you filled up your gas tank and actually felt okay about the price? Like, you didn't wince, you didn't do the math in your head, you just paid and moved on? For most people in the US and Europe, that feeling disappeared somewhere around 2021 and didn't really come back for a long time. Gas hit $5 a gallon in California. In the UK, people were queuing for hours at petrol stations. Germany, one of the most industrialized countries on the planet, was genuinely debating whether it could keep its factories running through winter. It was bad, and most people blamed the usual suspects: Putin, OPEC, COVID supply chains, big oil. But here's the thing nobody was really talking about at the time, and honestly, most people still aren't talking about it. China was quietly doing something that took the edge off the whole crisis. Not intentionally to help you, obviously. China doesn't make energy policy thinking about your commute. But the side effect of what they were doing at home ended up mattering a lot for oil prices globally. And the wild part? The same country that was getting hammered in Western headlines for pollution, for coal dependency, for being an environmental villain, was simultaneously becoming the single biggest reason the oil market didn't completely lose its mind. I know that sounds backwards. Stick with me. To understand this, you have to go back a few years. Because this story doesn't start with China, it starts with a number that most people outside the energy industry never think about. That number is called global oil demand. Every single day, the world burns through roughly 100 million barrels of oil. That's not a typo. 100 million barrels every day. And for decades, that number just kept climbing. More cars, more flights, more everything. The world's appetite for oil felt like it had no ceiling. Then COVID hit and demand crashed overnight. Airlines grounded, factories shut, people stopped driving. Oil prices went so negative, actually negative, that producers were paying people to take oil off their hands because there was literally nowhere to store it. And then came the rebound. When economies reopened, demand snapped back fast. Faster than supply could keep up with. And right in the middle of that already fragile recovery, Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. And suddenly one of the world's biggest oil and gas exporters was sanctioned, isolated, and partially cut off from global markets. The timing could not have been worse. Europe, which had spent years making itself dependent on Russian gas, was now scrambling. The US was releasing barrels from its strategic petroleum reserve, something you do when you're genuinely worried. OPEC was being pressured to pump more and mostly shrugging. Energy analysts were throwing around words like crisis and catastrophe with the kind of confidence that makes your stomach drop. And oil did spike. Brent crude hit $130 a barrel in March 2022. Some forecasts were calling for $200. But here's where the story gets interesting. It didn't get to $200, came back down. And by late 2023, prices were sitting in ranges that, while not exactly cheap, weren't the economy-destroying levels that people feared. Why? There are a few reasons, sure. The US kept pumping. Some Russian oil found its way to market through back channels. Demand in Europe softened because people were actually cold and conserving energy out of necessity. But one of the biggest factors, one that barely made the news in the way it deserved, was happening in China. See, while all of this was going on, China was in the middle of an electric vehicle explosion that had no real precedent in history. In 2020, EVs were about 5% of new car sales in China. By 2023, that number was pushing 35%. 1 in 3 new cars sold in China was electric. In some months, it crossed 40%. Now, China is not a small car market. China is the car market. They sell more cars per year than the US and Europe combined. So when the composition of that market starts shifting, when millions of people who would have bought a gasoline car instead buy an EV, the math on oil demand starts to change in ways that ripple outward. Every EV on the road is a car that isn't burning gasoline. Multiply that by millions of vehicles, and you're talking about a measurable dent in how much oil China needs to import. And China importing less oil matters to everyone because oil is a global commodity. The price you pay at a pump in Texas or in the suburbs of London is connected, in ways that aren't always obvious, to what's happening in Shenzhen and Shanghai. When Chinese demand growth slows or comes in below what the market expected, that pressure valve releases a little. Prices don't spike as hard. The crisis ceiling gets lower. Goldman Sachs actually put numbers on this. They estimated that China's EV adoption alone was suppressing oil demand by somewhere between 1 and 2 million barrels per day compared to what it would have been if adoption had stayed at 2019 levels. 1 to 2 million barrels a day. In a market where a 1 million barrel disruption can move prices by $10 or $15, that's not nothing. That's enormous. But the EVs were only part of the story. Because at the same time China was electrifying its roads, it was doing something else. Something even bigger, actually, when you look at the raw numbers. It was building solar panels. Obsessively. At a scale that genuinely doesn't have a comparison in history. In 2023, China installed more solar capacity than the entire United States has installed in its whole history. In 1 year. That's not a talking point, that's just the data from the International Energy Agency. And in 2024, they did it again. Now, solar doesn't directly replace oil the way an EV does. Most oil isn't used to generate electricity. It's used in transportation and industry. So you might be thinking, okay, what does solar have to do with the oil crisis? Fair question. And the answer is a little indirect, but it's real. Here's how it works. China runs a lot of its industrial operations, its heating, its backup power, on diesel, on fuel oil, on commodities that are directly tied to crude. When you build enough solar and wind to start displacing even a portion of that industrial energy demand, you're again talking about millions of barrels of oil equivalent that China doesn't need to import. And then there's the manufacturing economy angle. China makes a huge chunk of the world's goods. When Chinese factories can run on cheaper domestic solar power instead of imported fuel, their cost structure changes. Their dependency on the global oil market shrinks. And that matters, again, for the global price. It's all connected. Fewer EVs buying gas, fewer factories burning diesel, fewer power plants needing fuel oil. It adds up quietly, in the background, while the headlines are focused on OPEC meetings and Russian pipelines. There's also something that rarely gets discussed in Western coverage of this whole situation, and it's the question of why China moved so fast. Because it wasn't purely idealism. China didn't wake up one day and decide to save the planet. That's not how this works. China had a problem. A serious one. They were spending an almost obscene amount of money every year importing oil and gas. Energy security, meaning the ability to keep your economy running without being dependent on foreign suppliers, is something Chinese leadership thinks about constantly. It's existential for them. They watched what happened to Europe when Russian gas got cut off. They looked at their own exposure to Middle Eastern oil coming through shipping lanes that the US Navy essentially controls. And they did not like what they saw. So the EV push, the solar push, the battery manufacturing dominance, a lot of that was driven by a very cold, strategic calculation. Reduce dependency. Control your own energy future. Don't let your economy be held hostage by a commodity you don't produce enough of. The green outcome was almost a byproduct, which is kind of ironic when you think about it. The country that Western governments and media spent years criticizing for not taking climate seriously enough ended up making the most consequential moves on clean energy in history, largely for reasons that had nothing to do with climate. And here's where it gets complicated, because this story isn't simple, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I made it sound like China is just quietly heroic in all of this. The same country that's installing record solar is also still building coal plants. A lot of them. China burns more coal than the rest of the world combined. Their emissions are still going up in absolute terms. The pollution in major Chinese cities is still a serious public health crisis. So the picture is genuinely messy. It's not a clean narrative. It's a country that is simultaneously the world's biggest polluter and the world's biggest clean energy investor. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels out the other. But for the specific question of the oil crisis, for the question of why $200 oil didn't happen, why the worst predictions didn't come true, China's clean energy build-out is a real part of the answer that doesn't get enough credit. There's one more thing I want to leave you with because I think it matters for how we think about the next 10 years. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, which is about as mainstream an establishment as energy analysis gets, put out a report in 2023 that said something pretty striking. They said global oil demand is likely to peak before 2030, maybe as soon as 2025 or 2026. That was not the kind of thing the IEA was saying 5 years ago. 5 years ago, the assumption was that demand would keep climbing for decades. What changed their model? Largely, China. The speed of EV adoption, the speed of solar deployment, the data coming out of Asia that showed the energy transition wasn't some distant future thing. It was already happening, faster than almost anyone predicted. And if oil demand does peak in this decade, the geopolitics of energy change completely. Countries that built their entire national budgets around $80 or $90 oil start having a very different kind of problem. The leverage that petrostates have over the global economy starts to erode. The stranglehold that oil has had on global stability for 100 years begins, slowly, unevenly, messily, to loosen. None of that is guaranteed. Transitions are rarely clean, and China's own trajectory could shift, economically, politically, in ways nobody can fully predict right now. But the next time you fill up your tank and the price is painful but not catastrophic, and you're wondering why it isn't worse given everything going on in the world, part of the answer is in Beijing, in Shenzhen. In the factories making batteries and the rooftops covered in solar panels and the highways filling up with electric cars. It's not the story anyone expected to tell, but that's kind of the point. But let me ask you something that I haven't seen anyone really wrestle with. If China's clean energy transition is genuinely suppressing oil demand, keeping prices lower than they would otherwise be, then in a weird way, the rest of the world is getting a free ride on China's investment. Think about that for a second. American consumers are paying less at the pump, at least partially, because Chinese manufacturers are buying EVs. European factories are under slightly less pressure, at least partially, because Chinese rooftops are covered in solar panels. The countries that spent years pressuring China to do more on climate, that criticized China's environmental record in every international forum, that built trade policies specifically designed to slow down Chinese clean energy exports. Those same countries are quietly benefiting from exactly what they were asking China to do. So here's the question nobody is asking out loud. If China stopped, if they slowed down the EV push, if they pulled back on solar, if they said, fine, we'll just keep importing oil like everyone else, who actually suffers the most? Is the West prepared to answer that honestly? Because the uncomfortable truth might be that the energy transition China is leading isn't just good for China. It might be the thing quietly holding the global economy together right now, whether anyone wants to admit it or not. And I don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure anyone does.